Hello and welcome to the Charles River Conservancy Parkland show. My name is Renata von Tscharner. I'm the founder and president of the Charles River Conservancy, and these shows are about the river, swimming in the river, walking along the river, biking along the river. The show is about the parklands, how our volunteers take care of them. And often the question has come up, what is going to happen to Cambridge, the parklands, Cambridge in climate change? As the climate changes, as we might have a sea level rise, we might have more water. So I thought I'm going to get the experts. And here they are. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have Julie Wormser here, the executive director of the Boston Harbor Association, and you've been there for 3 years.
That's right.
And you've been in the environmental field for many years.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And Jason Hellendrung is from, you're a principal of Sasaki,
Yes, I am.
and Sasaki Associates are right on the Charles River,
We are.
near the Watertown Dam. So you know the river well. And
It's about 10 feet outside my office window.
lucky you. And you
It's a good view.
probably hear the waterfall outside it, which is such a beautiful
The most amazing time of the year is really in kind of May, early June, when the alewife are running and all the birds that are out there kind of doing some fishing, getting some food, and it's just amazing how it comes to life.
Wonderful. So I'd like you to tell me of how Sasaki and the Harbor Association, how you partnered on this issue of climate change, how that will affect obviously the harbor and Boston and Cambridge. How did your two groups meet and what was the project?
Sure. I'll start and you
Sure.
go. So Boston Harbor Association, it's 41 years old. We started out, as our name might imply, on Boston Harbor. And at that time, the water was so polluted, as was the Charles, that if you fell in, sure didn't want to go swimming, but if you fell in, it meant a trip to the hospital. So we started out working to clean up the harbor and restore the waterfront. That has been an extraordinary success story, as has been what you've been able to do with the Charles River.
Because the water of the Charles is a big part of the harbor, isn't
No
it?
question, no question, exactly. It all fits together.
Yeah.
We meet at the Charles River Dam. And but once we saw that our original mission was near completion, we started thinking about what else really affected Boston Harbor, and one of the big things is sea level rise. Sasaki had been a long-term partner of ours on waterfront development, and we came together to think about how could we look at resilient design. You know, we are very worried about sea level rise. What can people do about it in the built environment?
Sasaki, so we've been practicing for 61 years, and we're architects and landscape architects and planners, and we've been working with a lot of communities, probably going back about 40 plus years, and really connecting them to rivers and waterfronts and former industrial areas and transforming them into a place that people can come to the water and see the water and kind of the magic that is a part of it. And what we've seen more and more over the last really 10 plus years is in a lot of these instances where we're working with communities across the country and around the world that more and more frequently they're needing to deal with aspects of climate change and more frequent storms and more violent storms, and we've been doing that. And so we did an initiative and really reached out to TVHA on this aspect about a year and a half ago on an exhibit, Sea Change Boston. It really built off of the work that the Boston Harbor Association did with preparing for the rising tide. And that really set up what were some of the vulnerabilities for the greater Boston area to sea level rise. And as designers and planners, we looked at and said, well, let's start looking at this as what are some of the strategies of the things that we can do, and had an exhibit this spring to look at that.
So what you have done in this work, learned, you can now apply that in all other countries, other parts of the country, and so that's what's wonderful. And I think we're very grateful for Sasaki to have done that work. I understand pro bono, but it probably will benefit other places and the firm in the long run. So that's a very enlightened act.
Yes,
Yeah.
no question.
Yeah. So let's start with this publication. This is the cover of this publication, Designing with Water. are we looking? What river are we looking at here?
This is one of our case studies, which I might talk about up front. This is the Cheonggyecheon Channel in Seoul, South Korea. And this had been a capped, polluted canal with a elevated highway above it, much like the Southeast Expressway in downtown Boston. And it really was a blight running through Seoul. That it was smelly, it was dirty, it was dark. It was really a failed development.
Dark? Was it covered, or was just the water was dark?
The canal was capped. It was totally covered, but it still smelled. And then it had an elevated highway. Recently, they took the highway down. They cleaned up the river or the canal. They made it into this beautiful, beautiful water element. Similar to the Charles or similar to the Fenway. But then when they get a big rain, that becomes a flood control. So it might flood halfway up those walls, but then their streets remain completely clear. So this is an example of managing water, so it can be very beautiful during non-flood times, but then it keeps water away from our buildings and our basements and our infrastructure during flood times.
So this image reminds me of the Tiber in Rome, which also has walls on both sides, and it can be a very austere environment, but it needs to take care of the water as well.
Yes.
So let's start looking at the map here. Maybe you can tell us what the color elements are. The Charles River, we see it coming in from the left there.
Yep. So this is a map of what flooding occurs in Greater Boston. So again, Cambridge is the upper left, and the dark river is the Charles River. This is what flooding happens when you have sea levels of high tide plus about 5 feet. It causes 7% of Boston to flood. Cambridge doesn't flood much because of the Charles River Dam. And as you know well, there are enormous, enormous pumps that keep the water level controlled in the Charles. So in the question of what will climate change do to Cambridge, short term, we're very lucky that that those pumps really protect the Charles River from the dam from overtopping. That the MWRA controls the level of the river very carefully. So short term, Cambridge is really much more affected by extreme storm events, extreme rain, extreme snow. The Boston side doesn't have such protection. So Boston has missed this level of flooding 4 times since Hurricane Sandy, including Hurricane Sandy. This is how much flooding occurred during the blizzard of '78, which was the biggest flood we've ever seen. But we almost got that level of flooding within half a tide cycle 4 times since 2012.
And it was also in '78 that actually the locks on the Charles were put into power because there was flooding of the muddy river.
Yes.
So there has been flooding along the Charles, the muddy river, and it very much affected the subway, and it affected the Longwood Medical area.
Right.
So I think the dam is wonderful that you can push the water out against the high tide.
Yes.
Sometimes the Charles, is higher than the high tide, and you can still push it out.
But we wouldn't see a high tide that would overtop the dam really until the end of the century. It's still very startling to think of it being that soon, but a lot of things will change before the Charles River Dam overtops. We'll see a lot of widespread flooding elsewhere.
Yeah. So you have another map here.
So this is a very scary map. This is a map where the pink is 2 to 4 feet of flooding. This is what would happen if we saw today's high tide plus 7.5 feet higher water. That could happen from an extreme high tide, we call it wicked high tide, when the sun and the moon align and exert the same pull.
Now, don't we have right now a wicked high tide?
Today we have a wicked high tide. You saw that today.
We do. We do. So today or tomorrow, both cycles are right about at lunchtime, 12:40 today. And if you go down to Long Wharf or Fan Pier or Morrissey Boulevard, you'll see it. Today at Long Wharf, water was actually going onto
Onto the wharf.
wharf and onto the walkway. So pretty amazing. People ask that and say, if we look at sea level rise and what's the impact 2050 or 2100, why do we need to do anything today? Or today? Well, you can go out today and see
Yes.
what reason that is, and it's just going to be continuing to get worse.
Yeah.
And that's in the absence of a storm. So this kind of flooding, it's not just a question of sea level rise. It's sea level rise plus storms plus tide that gets this kind of flooding. So we wouldn't necessarily see this level of flooding till mid-century when we see a couple more feet of sea level rise. This is when the Charles River Dam would start to overtop in big storms. But the other thing that you see from this map is that about a third of the city of Boston and quite a bit of the city of Cambridge is below 8 feet above high tide, right? So it's within 8 feet of high tide. These are all the former tidelands. These are all the former salt marshes. So we forget that Boston is really almost like a Bangladesh or a Nile River Delta or a Louisiana in miniature.
And what does that mean?
It means that so the original European colonists came to a place that was full
Marshland.
of marshlands. And we, over the last 300 years, filled them to make dry land for now. But what this kind of map shows us is that so much of that fill, because it was all done by hand and horses, is very, very close to high tide. So because we have the Charles River Dam, because we have a very protective harbor, we don't see the kinds of storm surges that a New York sees or a Gulf of Mexico sees. But once we start to flood, that flooding will be widespread because we are so close to high tide.
Mm-hmm.
That's our design problem.
Mm-hmm. So you kind of show us these scary maps of what is coming. And so your project and your exhibition looked at how other places have addressed these issues. And obviously the Dutch and other countries, they have
And Germany.
They had to live with that. So maybe we have a chart here which might be hard to read, but maybe you can at least explain the symbols because that is then tied into some examples.
Sure. So the maps that Julie was just talking to were part of the Preparing for the Rising Tide report that Boston Harbor Association published back in February of 2013. And that really led us to kind of getting to this point of understanding what the vulnerabilities were to sea level rise, starting to then look forward to what some of the strategies were. And so as we looked at that, we started to try to identify some different strategies and great case studies from around the world that we could all learn from.
Mm-hmm.
And what we did was initially we organized some, what we call them as the Designing with Water principles.
Mm-hmm.
And so we broke it down to 5. First was for designing with resilience, so that if there were future storms or threats that we could, or some sort of disturbance, that a community would be able to bounce back. The second was what we call double duty solutions, or efforts where there would be mutual benefits. So we could protect neighborhoods or areas, but there could be other aspects to it, like you could create a river walk.
Mm-hmm.
That could be a place where people could come to the water, but that it could function at different times to help protect areas. A third key kind of principle to the whole effort was really strengthening community resilience. So it was about engaging all parts of the population and helping to come up with some of these decisions.
Yeah. Let me just interrupt you here. I remember when your study was announced earlier this summer, there was Brian Sweat from the city of Boston who said, well, if there was a snowstorm announced, you all know what to do. You get your shovel, you get, what to do. But we're not prepared for when the water goes up. This is not something that we have experienced.
It's new for us.
It's new for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that really stuck with me, that we can handle snow, but we don't know how to handle
Mhm.
water. So
Mhm.
That's
I guess that is that
Right.
part of the community resilience.
And that was another one of the key principles was how can we start to institutionalize this and set this up in a way that people can start phasing this in over time so that we can start looking at zoning and kind of changing some of our buildings or elevating our buildings or coming up with the different communication strategies so that if there is a high water event during a storm, that people know what they need to do.
Mhm.
And so kind of bringing up this whole program together and really starting to institutionalize it where it could be seen in educational programs starting with kids
Yeah.
and that they're growing up in this way of their life
Yeah,
rather than
yeah.
just the harbor being something that they go and look at when
Yeah.
they go to the aquarium.
Right.
So let me bring us back to the chart here. After the strengthen community resilience, you have the yellow one.
Sure, which is incentivizing and institutionalizing, and that gets into some of the components around building guidelines and zoning and coming up with those strategies for cities, and then looking at how we phase it. I think that's something that we've heard a lot about is people saying this is a really daunting task. Where's this going? And I think this is really the starting point where the conversation's going in a lot of different directions around the city and the region. Many of the cities are talking about it. And that can start to become this foundation that can get integrated into all the plans that people are doing in neighborhoods or different parts of different cities.
And Cambridge is obviously is kind of on the forefront of that. There's a climate change committee with John Baldock, and Boston is also doing a great job. I think the new mayor is very aware of that and very much
Yes.
active in that. So, where we were lucky with Sandy, I think New York got a much ruder awakening than Boston or Cambridge did.
Yes.
So, but we could have been hit really hard then too.
And since Hurricane Sandy, I know, Jason, you've done a number of presentations. I've probably done close to 100 presentations on sea level rise preparedness. And people often ask, so has interest died down? And it hasn't. I've actually never seen public policy move as quickly as I have seen on
Wow.
preparedness. And I think because it is so immediate, it's one that people say, oh, if I recycle or if I save energy, it helps me a little bit, but it's, a drop in the bucket of what's needed. But when it's about flooding your basement, you say, what do I do? This is very, very immediate. And writ large, the government say, we don't want any people to die. We don't want to ruin neighborhoods. What do we do to plan out ahead to make sure what happened in New York doesn't damage Boston if we get the same kind of storm?
Yeah. So let's look at some of the examples you studied.
Sure, we have a few of the case studies that we've organized in the report, and what we tried to do with each of them was really highlight different levels, whether it's building specific or if it's neighborhood specific or if it's even broader, at a regional scale. And the first one we have here is the Cuisinart Center for Culinary Excellence. This is in Providence, right on the waterfront. It's at Johnson Wales University, and this is really where the Providence River and Narragansett Bay come together. This is just a couple hundred feet from the water. And what's really extraordinary about this building is that you see it here hovering up above the land below, and it really was built with what's you can term as a sacrificial first floor. All of the critical components and all of the mechanical elements that they have, whether it's computers or different equipment that they have. Johnson Wales is a culinary arts school. That's all on the upper floors. And the first floor is really just reception space and some meeting space.
Yeah.
And so they treat that as really the sacrificial space that can flood in the future without damaging all these.
Doesn't Boston have the new Spalding Hospital?
Well-
Has some of these elements.
Spalding is our great example
Oh,
of adaptive design, but we want more than just Spalding. So they're terrific. I think one of the fun things about the Cuisinart Center is they actually have breakaway glass. It's almost like a stunt building. So if they have a huge storm surge, the first floor actually it fails quickly, fails cheaply is their idea. And it keeps the building in true so that it doesn't destroy the whole building.
They already have that in Florida in some residential
I believe
areas.
it.
I know a house that was built where you couldn't have some serious use downstairs. You could have maybe a den, and,
Yes.
but then the walls are easily removed.
And it saves
Yeah.
the rest of the house.
Yeah,
Yeah, so that's this idea. So this is the idea of you're not trying to keep water out, that would be resistance or prevention. This is resilience. How do you bounce back quickly and cheaply? And that's one of the principles.
All right. So let's look at this example here.
This is here in Cambridge, which is why we included it today. This is the Alewife Stormwater Wetland. So Route 2, right at the base of the Belmont Hill, floods and floods and floods, or flooded and flooded and flooded, between Belmont and Mass Ave. And so the Public Works Department decided that they had to do something, and they had the option of building a bigger built infrastructure, where there are giant culverts and storage tanks. They decided instead to create an artificial wetlands on parkland. It's actually state parkland.
DCR land.
DCR land. And so this is this idea of doing double duty. So they had a problem with flooding on their roads. They needed to get that water off the road and actually to be retained so it doesn't flood where they don't want it to be. They created a beautiful 3-acre, I think, stormwater wetland. I've seen swans there now.
Yeah.
It has a beautiful running path and a boardwalk. It is very, very popular recreation land now.
And that's where landscape skills come in to turn that,
That's right.
not instead of having concrete walls that retain something, you create a beautiful landscape.
Exactly.
And that is,
And this is very relevant, particularly to the Upper Charles.
Yeah, which could have been a concrete barrier, but then Lydia Goodhue came and said, well, let's find another way of doing it.
Which is fantastic. And she was very prescient, because now we're going back to these ideas of reclaiming land.
Yeah. So you have here
a
bunch of lovely people.
Love this. So this is, you were asking about community resilience. And this is a great example in England. So Gloucestershire is a rural county in England. 20% of the residents are senior citizens, and it's very dispersed. There's not a real strong town center. So there's nothing they could build to increase resilience. They created a program, a government program called Village Agents, where younger adults would look in on their elderly neighbors. And this was really for public health reasons. Did they have the medications they needed? Did they have food, access to fresh water? While they were doing the pilot project for this Village Agent program, they had a historic flood where they got 3 months of rain in 3 days.
Wow.
None of the seniors died.
Because they had the system in
Because
place.
they already had the system in place. And this idea of social resilience, of do you know where the vulnerable people are? And are they getting the services they need? So it's people taking care of each other.
And that problem came in France when they had these heat waves, and they did not have air conditioning, they not even had cross ventilation, and a lot of old people died. And they learned the lesson the hard way. It's a whole social network.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because it wouldn't have been that hard had they known everybody who was vulnerable to get them to a cool place.
Yeah.
So this I don't want to go into too more, because this is the same example as before. This is the Chungachung channel. This is just a different part of the channel and at night. But as you can see, it is a stunning water element right downtown Seoul. And it has, instead of being this blighted, smelly industrial area, it is now a must-see element of Seoul. And it has attracted tremendous business investment and recreation.
Yeah. So let's move on to something that looks a little bit more like the Charles.
Yes.
Sure, and this right here is Room for the River Wall. This is in the Netherlands, and this is a great example because it hits on really so many. And the Netherlands had their really dramatic storms in the 50s. Thousands of people died, and they built all of their system of dikes, and it worked really effectively to protect them from storms from the seas. But what happened was they had inland flooding then in the 90s. And so they created this project, which was Room for the River. And it started to look at all the inland rivers and started to take some of these areas and actually taking some of these areas that were really wetlands and marshlands and the polders, and transform them back into the floodplains that they previously had been, so that in those future events, that they wouldn't have that inland flooding. So it's kind of a great case study that you can look at here when we start talking about sea level rise on the harbor, but then also flooding on the Charles River too.
And I think this is much more relevant to the Charles, particularly short term, when you're talking about freshwater flooding.
Yeah.
And again, with the engineering of the dams, you can lower those levels of the river, but the Dutch have that as well. So looking at those areas in the Charles, is there an opportunity to widen the channel? Is there an opportunity to have a second channel like this that really manages that water level?
Yeah. Well, you bring up a lot of interesting issues, and I hope Sasaki will help to look at some of these problems in along the Charles and come up with some interesting solutions, some infrastructure issues that need to be addressed, because those seawalls, they look very solid, but they crumble the moment any water pressure is behind them.
It's good to know.
Yeah. So let's look at the other dramatic picture here.
This is another example of this is the last strategy that we included from the report. There are 12 total in designing with water, and then we've got actually a great appendix of other examples. But this is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. We included this. This was a project that we had been involved with. We were creating a riverfront master plan for the city in 2008, just getting started.
Okay.
And then they had a flood. And so we then worked with them in an effort to really look at how to come up with a community-based redevelopment strategy that could help rebuild all of their city. So it looked at really all of the aspects of engaging all the community, what kind of plan could be put in place that could look at areas that better protect them in the future, and help to also better position it, in terms of those co-benefits that we talk about, like areas to bring the community together.
I would love to hear more, but so I will now give the website of where people can find out more, because our program is almost finished. But I want to thank you both, and I will now put up the website of Sasaki and of the Boston Harbor Association, so that people can actually go and look at the full report.
Yes.
And I much appreciate the work you've done, and that we can all learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.